Millionaire CEO sees his ex-wife at a restaurant with twins who look like him and is left speechless when approaching them. But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now subscribe to the channel and let's get started. Jonathan Blake slid out of the back seat of a sleek black sedan and took a moment to absorb the shimmering lights of the restaurant's grand entrance. It was supposed to be a quick escape from the endless stress of his office, an evening spent enjoying quiet conversation and a decent meal in a place where he wouldn't be bombarded by phone calls or urgent messages. Yet he couldn't shake the restless weight in his chest, the sense that something was brewing just beyond his line of sight. His friend and assistant Marcus greeted him with a polite nod and guided him through a set of tall glass doors. Inside, soft chandeliers cast warm glows on polished floors, and the elegant murmur of refined conversation floated between white-clothed tables. Gentle piano music drifted from a corner, soothing any ears open enough to listen. Jonathan and Marcus made their way past discreet waitstaff and impeccably dressed couples. A few diners turned curious eyes his way, no doubt aware that Jonathan Blake was the famously driven CEO of a growing tech empire. He did his best to ignore those stares, forcing a smile at the maitre d', who led them to a private table set near a tall window overlooking the city lights. As Jonathan slipped into his chair, he tugged lightly at his tie, still feeling caged by the day's tensions. He noticed Marcus studying him in that concerned way he did whenever the pressure seemed too much. "Sir?" Marcus said softly, leaning in so only Jonathan could hear. "I've been hearing unsettling rumblings, something about new developments that could hurt the company's stocks." Jonathan exhaled, pushing down a ripple of frustration. "I can't even enjoy a single meal without hearing about hostile takeovers or competitor sabotage." Marcus shrugged, his gaze thoughtful. "That's the nature of success, isn't it? Everyone wants what you have. You sure you don't want to talk about it?" Jonathan offered a quick wave of dismissal. "No, not tonight. Let's keep business to a minimum." But even as he said it, he couldn't quite convince himself. They placed orders for the evening special, exchanging a few more hushed remarks about corporate sharks. Jonathan listened politely, though his thoughts drifted. He rubbed the back of his neck, wishing he could loosen the tension physically pressing on him. Then, in a moment of pure habit, he scanned the restaurant. The corners were dim, the atmosphere hushed. At first, he only registered vague shapes of people, couples leaning in close, a cluster of colleagues raising glasses. His eyes paused near the far side of the room, where the glow of a chandelier lit up a familiar face. A memory, once haunting, rushed in with startling clarity. Imani, his ex-wife, sitting at a small table wearing a deep red dress that highlighted her graceful posture. His heart stumbled as if it tripped over itself. The last time he'd seen her, words were thrown like daggers, and the silence that followed had lasted years. She wasn't alone. Two little girls, dark-haired and wide-eyed, flanked her. They looked about 5 or 6, maybe younger. It took mere seconds for Jonathan to register something else: the sharp lines of their cheeks, the gentle curve of their eyes, features that stirred an unexpected sense of familiarity in him. He couldn't tear his gaze away. The children looked so much like— No, that couldn't be. His pulse quickened. Regret, curiosity, and a dozen unspoken questions melted into a swirling knot in his stomach. "Mr. Blake," Marcus whispered, catching sight of his transfixed stare. "Are you all right?" Jonathan swallowed hard, trying to compose himself. "I'm fine," he murmured, though he was clearly anything but. He forced his gaze down to the folded napkin in his lap, hoping the pounding in his chest would ease. Yet that moment of forced composure proved fleeting. His eyes were drawn back to the other table, searching for an explanation. Imani slowly looked up, as if she sensed him. Their eyes locked across the restaurant, a flash of recognition, hesitation, and then something like heartbreak passed over her elegant features. She blinked, turning her attention to the girls, speaking softly to them. One of them glanced up, and for a brief instant, Jonathan thought he saw the same flicker of awareness in that child's face. Marcus cleared his throat, trying again to break Jonathan's silent trance. "Sir, do you want me to handle this somehow?" "No," Jonathan said quietly, pressing his fingertips to his temple. His entire being felt stirred, memories firing off like sparks behind his eyes. He had never known children were part of Imani's life. His mind whirled. Could they really be his? A father? He'd told himself for years that family was not in his immediate plan. But all along, could he have already been a father without knowing? His appetite vanished. He couldn't begin to focus on the meal. He noticed the way Imani's posture changed, straightened shoulders, subtly defensive, clearly torn between ignoring him and acknowledging a truth that lay in the space between them. The two girls stared at their menus, oblivious to the adult tension overhead. In the midst of this, a flicker of movement at another table drew Jonathan's attention. A man with a small camera phone angled discreetly in their direction. Jonathan had run into paparazzi plenty of times. He recognized the hungry, opportunistic grin. Tonight, of all nights, the restaurant was not as private as he'd hoped. He closed his eyes for a moment, frustration mounting. The last thing he needed was to feed the rumor mill. If those pictures got out, if speculation about him having children, secret children, leaked, it could upend everything. His empire was already threatened by shadowy rivals. Suddenly, the hush around him felt even more claustrophobic. He overheard idle chatter from a nearby table. Two whispering diners, obviously enthralled by the gossip potential. He caught an unmistakable phrase, "He's never acknowledged having kids, at least not publicly." Marcus tensed, sensing Jonathan's rising agitation. "We can leave," he offered under his breath. Jonathan nodded slowly, inhaling deeply to steady himself. "Let's go. This isn't the time or place." A waiter arrived with their entrees, but Jonathan offered a polite, "I'm sorry," and a quiet request to box the food. He stood, hand trembling ever so slightly, and slipped a credit card to the waiter. The waitstaff remained gracefully composed, but Jonathan couldn't help feeling the weight of curious stares. On the way out, he adjusted his tie again, footsteps brisk, heartbeat hammering in his ears. Marcus walked close behind, eyes darting around for signs of more prying cameras. Just as Jonathan neared the door, a swirl of red in the corner of his vision made him pause. Imani had also risen from her seat. She stood with the girls next to the hostess's podium. Their eyes met in a fleeting moment of uncertain connection. Her lips parted as though she might speak, but the hush of the restaurant consumed them. Instead, she nodded a subtle acknowledgement, ushering the twins toward the exit. The children gave Jonathan the wide-eyed look of strangers unsure if they should wave or hide. He wanted to say something, anything, but words lodged in his throat. All he managed was a faint nod back. Then Imani guided the girls outside. The glow of the chandelier fell behind them, and all Jonathan could do was follow at a distance, weaving through hushed diners and half-lowered gazes until he reached the front doors. The valet brought his car around just as Imani stepped to the curb, hailing a taxi. The two girls climbed inside, bright eyes scanning the night. Imani glanced over her shoulder, meeting Jonathan's gaze one last time. He couldn't recall a moment of such raw longing and confusion compressing his chest. The taxi door shut with a firm click. The taillights merged into the city traffic, disappearing down a row of gleaming street lamps. Marcus placed a hand on Jonathan's shoulder. "You all right?" he asked quietly. Jonathan stood there, breath ragged, eyes trained on the dimming glow of the cab in the distance. He could still see the faces of the twins burned into his memory, so undeniably familiar it made him ache. He turned to Marcus, voice laced with determination. "I'm not sure what just happened in there," he said, "but it changes everything." Marcus nodded, not entirely surprised by the note of fierce conviction in Jonathan's tone. It was the voice of a man who refused to let another chance slip through his fingers. They walked to Jonathan's car in charged silence, the night air heavy with unspoken possibilities. As the driver held the door open, Jonathan paused, looking back at the glittering windows of the restaurant. Only minutes ago, he had wanted nothing more than to escape the clamor of his own mind. Now, he found himself longing to dive headfirst into a truth that might turn his world upside down. And that truth had two small faces, bright with curiosity and innocence, staring back at him. Once safely in his seat, Jonathan closed his eyes, pressing his thumb and forefinger together at the bridge of his nose, as if trying to ease an oncoming headache. "What are you going to do?" Marcus ventured. Jonathan opened his eyes to the blur of passing headlights. "I don't know," he replied, his voice grave. "But I can't ignore this. If those girls... I have to find out." Marcus nodded in understanding. They fell silent for the remainder of the ride, each lost in private thoughts of complicated futures and precarious fortunes. They arrived at the curb of Jonathan's high-rise building, stepping out onto the quiet sidewalk. Before Marcus could bid goodnight, Jonathan let out a long breath, gazing at the direction in which the taxi had vanished not long before. He felt a new sort of urgency pulsing through his veins, far different from the standard business crises he fought daily. This was personal, filled with regret and a glimmer of hope he hadn't felt in years. Standing beneath the glowing city lights, he turned to Marcus with resolve. He watched the taxi drive away in his mind's eye once more, heart pounding, certain that the little girls carried a secret he could no longer ignore. Then he met Marcus's concerned stare and said the only words that mattered: "I need to find out the truth, no matter what it costs." Jonathan woke the next morning in his penthouse, eyes gritty from too little sleep. He had drifted off at some impossible hour, staring at the city lights and replaying the scene from the restaurant. No matter how many times he relived it, the image remained the same. His ex-wife, Imani, with two little girls who might share his blood. The possibilities churned in his mind, slipping into every corner of his thoughts. He dragged himself out of bed and stepped onto the terrace. Early sunlight broke over skyscrapers, painting the horizon with streaks of pale pink and gold. The usual satisfaction he felt looking out at this city, one he had conquered through ambition, was nowhere to be found. Instead, a prickling urgency itched behind his chest. He had to understand where Imani had been all these years, why she'd hidden these children, if indeed they were his. Marcus, always punctual, appeared at the door around 7. He carried the same subtle air of concern he'd worn last night. Jonathan invited him into the spacious living area where glass walls offered a sweeping view of downtown. "I need your help," Jonathan began, running a hand through his hair. "Find everything you can on Imani. I need an address, phone records, anything." Marcus nodded, though his expression reflected caution. "I'll do it discreetly. But are you sure you want to go down this road so abruptly?" Jonathan leaned against the back of a leather chair, feeling as though he was on the verge of pacing. "I don't have a choice, I just need to know what's happened." "All right," Marcus said, setting his laptop on a low table. "I'll get started right away." While Marcus typed, Jonathan tried to drink a cup of coffee, but the taste was bitter on his tongue. He was used to tackling problems head-on, hostile acquisitions, product failures, legal tangles, but this was different. The stakes felt profoundly personal. Already he could feel a pressure so unlike the professional burden he wore daily. It came from a place of longing and guilt. His phone buzzed just as he was about to refill his coffee. The number on the screen belonged to one of his board members, a typically unshakable man who rarely called him directly. Jonathan steadied himself before answering, stepping onto the terrace to keep the conversation private. "Jonathan," came the anxious voice on the other end. "There's chatter on the investor forums about unusual trading activity. It could be nothing, but it feels like someone's angling for more than a routine position in the company." Jonathan's jaw clenched. A potential hostile takeover. Not the best time for him to be mentally distracted by personal matters, yet here he was. "Do we know who's behind it?" he asked, keeping his voice level. "Not yet," the board member replied, sounding tense. "I'll keep you updated, but you should brace yourself." Ending the call, Jonathan took a deep breath. He cast a glance back at Marcus, who was still working in the living room. He didn't want to pull his assistant away from the search for Imani's current situation, but ignoring the company's possible meltdown wasn't an option. He returned indoors with a tight expression. "News from the board?" Marcus asked without looking up from the laptop screen. "Yeah, more trouble," Jonathan muttered, forcing himself to take measured steps rather than pace. "Keep working, but I might need you to shift your focus soon if something big breaks." Marcus nodded, then paused. "I have a possible address for Imani," he said, gesturing to his screen. "It's a modest townhouse in a neighborhood about 30 minutes from here. She's been there a few months." Jonathan's heart hammered. "So she's been in the city for a while now?" "Looks that way." Marcus glanced over the data. "She moved in quietly. No big announcements. She seems to keep a low profile." Jonathan's mind teemed with questions. Why would she suddenly return to this city, the same place where he was most visible? What was her plan? His anxiety sharpened into a determination laced with hope. The rest of the day drifted by in a haze. Jonathan tried to focus on urgent matters at the office, but images of the two little girls wouldn't leave him. He found himself staring out the window of his top-floor suite, absently tapping a pen against polished wood. He excused himself from a budget meeting sooner than expected, claiming he had pressing obligations. He spent the afternoon catching up on developments about the rumored takeover, communicating with legal teams, and ensuring no damaging leaks could harm the company's standing. But even the weight of potential corporate ruin couldn't overshadow the question forming at the forefront of his thoughts. Were those children truly his daughters? An old friend, someone he'd once partnered with on early ventures, called later to check in. They talked about business troubles for a few minutes. Then the friend changed his tone, voice dropping low. "I heard a rumor," his friend began, "that you were seen at a restaurant looking unsettled. Something about kids at a nearby table?" Jonathan clicked his jaw shut. "News travels fast, doesn't it?" he managed, eyes flicking to the floor. "People pay attention to big players, especially if they sense a personal scandal. Be careful. You know how these rumors can spiral, especially if your enemies plan to use it." "I appreciate the concern," Jonathan replied, "but this is personal, and I can handle it. Just remember, sometimes the personal stuff bites back harder than the business side." When the call ended, Jonathan reached for the jacket slung over his chair. The idea of simply calling Imani felt too abrupt. He wanted to see her environment for himself, to gather his courage. So he decided he'd take a drive, just to the address Marcus found. No confrontation yet. Just a look. Late afternoon light glinted off the hood of Jonathan's car as he parked in a quiet street lined with neat, modest townhomes. He killed the engine and exhaled slowly. The neighborhood had a peaceful charm, children's bicycles on porches, a well-tended park just down the block. It felt an entire world away from his high-rise penthouse. He spotted Imani's townhouse number and recognized her sleek shape in the doorway. She stepped out carrying a small bag of groceries. Right behind her, two little girls dashed out wearing matching sneakers and bright backpacks. One pointed excitedly at something on the lawn while the other hopped playfully on the sidewalk. Jonathan slumped lower in his seat, heart pounding. He hadn't expected them to appear so soon. His eyes locked on the children's faces, noting every detail. The curve of their cheeks, how they brushed hair out of their eyes the same way, the bright wonder in their expressions. A wave of undeniable recognition swept through him. Imani ushered them toward the sidewalk. He could see her gentle smile, the way she guided them protectively. She'd always had a calm, warm presence, one of the many things that had drawn him to her in the first place. Despite the distance, he could sense the love she poured into every motion around the girls. They started walking toward the small park at the end of the street. Jonathan, hands shaking on the steering wheel, felt an almost irresistible urge to jump out and call Imani's name. But he held himself back, aware of how jarring it might be for her and the children if he appeared unannounced. He was just getting used to the idea of being a father, and they had no idea he was watching. Instead, he waited until they disappeared beyond a row of hedges before starting his car again. He headed home in silence, mind reeling with 1,000 possibilities. When he reached his penthouse, the sky had already turned a dusky purple. City lights blinked on, matching the restless sparkle in his eyes. He set his keys on the kitchen counter, ignoring the messages that blinked on his phone. In the hush of the evening, he finally allowed himself to process what he'd seen. He felt both elated and terrified. The girls he'd glimpsed were so innocent, so bright, and they lived in a much smaller world than the one he inhabited. He wanted to be part of their life, if that was even possible. But how could he do that without exposing them to the harsh spotlight that followed him everywhere? A noise in the living room broke his thought. Marcus had come by, letting himself in with a spare key, an arrangement they'd had for years, ever since Jonathan's schedule grew too unpredictable. "You okay?" Marcus asked. Jonathan nodded, though he was clearly rattled. "I went to see her place," he admitted. "I didn't go inside. I watched them." Marcus raised a brow. "And? They look just like me," Jonathan whispered, feeling his throat tighten. "God, I can't just stand by, but I don't want to blow up their life overnight." Marcus offered a gentle pat on Jonathan's shoulder. "One step at a time." "You want me to make an introduction? Arrange a meeting?" Jonathan thought about the moment on the street when he almost bolted out of the car. He shook his head. "No, I need to reach out to her myself. I need to do this the right way." A pause hung between them, thick with significance. Marcus inclined his head, a trace of relief on his face. "Go for it, then. She has to hear from you eventually." Jonathan spent the next hour sitting alone in his favorite armchair, the city's glow reflecting on the glass walls. He rehearsed what he might say, how to start a conversation that might change everything. At times, he nearly convinced himself to put it off, to wait another day. But the memory of the twins, their bright eyes and unfiltered joy, pushed him forward. Finally, late in the evening, he took a breath, grabbed his phone, and found Imani's number. He had never deleted it, though it had gone unused for years. His heart pounded so loudly in his chest that he wondered if it might echo in the empty room. That night, Jonathan dials Imani's number, heart pounding as the phone rings, and then he hears her voice answering, as uncertain as his own. Jonathan sat with his phone still pressed to his ear, heart pounding so hard he worried Imani might hear it through the line. Her hello was hesitant, the syllable cut short as if she immediately regretted picking up. Neither spoke for several seconds, and the silence crackled with raw tension, like a wound exposed after being bandaged too long. His throat felt tight. All the words he'd rehearsed scattered in his mind. Finally, he cleared his throat and said her name, softer than he intended. "Imani?" She answered with a cautious dip in her voice. "Jonathan." He closed his eyes, recalling the warmth he'd once known in that voice. The memory was painful, reminding him of all they'd lost. "Thank you for taking my call," he said. "I'm sure it's the last thing you expected, me calling after so long." A small, humorless laugh came through. "You think?" she said. But there was no malice in her tone, only guarded caution. "What do you want, Jonathan?" It was the question he'd dreaded, though he knew it was coming. He glanced through the glass walls of his penthouse, out into the city lights that once symbolized his ambitions. Now they felt like a cage around him. "I saw you at that restaurant. I saw the girls. I just need to talk to you. Can we meet somewhere? In person?" Silence. If she was breathing, it was too quiet for him to tell. His heart thumped, a dull ache in his chest. He knew she had every right to turn him away. Still, it shook him how desperately he wanted her to say yes. After another pause, she agreed, her voice hushed. Fine. Tomorrow morning. There's a cafe on Westlake Road near the old bookstore. 9 o'clock. He almost exhaled too hard into the phone. I'll be there. She ended the call without saying goodbye. For several moments, Jonathan stayed frozen, phone in hand, listening to the faint echo of her last breath. Then he sank into his chair, eyes closed, thankful for even that slender chance. Morning arrived in a blur of worry and restless anticipation. Despite the backlog of business crises awaiting him, murmurs of a takeover, suspicious trades, he put on his suit with care, mentally rehearsing a calm approach for whatever conversation lay ahead. He forced down a piece of toast, then left early to navigate traffic. The cafe was a modest place, tucked beside a row of old brick buildings. Sunlight streamed through large windows, giving the space a warm glow. A few patrons chatted quietly over pastries and coffee. Jonathan chose a small table near the back, away from prying eyes. He glanced at his watch. 8:55. Nerves bundled in his stomach. At exactly 9, the door opened with a gentle chime. Imani stepped inside, scanning the room until her gaze landed on him. Her posture was stiff, her eyes reserved. She wore a simple blouse and skirt, understated but elegant, a reminder that she'd never needed flashy displays to hold his attention. He rose to greet her, but the words got tangled on his tongue. She approached slowly, and they shared an awkward nod before settling across from each other. The silence bore down. A waitress bustled over, giving them a welcoming smile. "Coffee?" the waitress asked brightly. Imani ordered tea. Jonathan asked for a refill of black coffee. Once the waitress left, they faced each other again. He noticed the faint circles under Imani's eyes, as if she'd slept no better than he had. "So," Imani began, keeping her voice low, "you wanted to talk. Let's get it over with." He swallowed, feeling as though he was balancing on a wire suspended high above. "Look," he said, "I know we're not on good terms, and it's my fault how things ended. I was too consumed by my work, my ambition. And now, seeing you with those girls, I just need to know, are they—" Imani's eyes flashed, cutting him off. "Are they yours? Is that what you want to ask?" Her jaw tightened. "I wondered how long it would take for you to come around with that question." Jonathan held her gaze. "Yes," he answered, voice almost a whisper. "I need to know." She gripped the edges of the table as though steadying herself. "Do you really want to know, or do you just want to satisfy your curiosity?" She paused for a second as if searching his face. "Layla and Leah are 6 years old. You can do the math." A breath hitched in Jonathan's chest. There it was, all but confirmed. He felt a strange mix of relief and fear, like a door swinging open to a room he never expected to see. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked, more gently than he'd planned. "All those years. Why keep them a secret?" Imani's expression hardened. "After the divorce, I realized I was pregnant. We were barely speaking. You were traveling the world sealing deals, and I was alone. I decided you didn't need the distraction, and honestly, I didn't think I could handle the heartbreak if you didn't want them." He pressed his fingertips together, the sting of guilt coursing through him. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it. "I really am. If I had known—" "But you didn't," she interrupted, not unkindly. "And maybe that's on me. I was scared. I wasn't sure if you'd brush them aside or parade them around like trophies." Her lips trembled slightly. "I loved you once, Jonathan, but I also saw what your ambition did to us." Their drinks arrived, providing a brief reprieve. Jonathan thanked the waitress and stared down at his coffee. Steam curled up, briefly fogging his vision. "Things are different now," he finally said. "I've grown. I made mistakes, and I want a chance to do better. I owe it to you, and them, to try." Imani lifted her teacup, eyes flicking around to ensure no one overheard. "I'm not sure I believe that," she admitted. But if you're serious, know that I won't let you show up and vanish again. The girls, they've never known you, and I've never told them much. I wasn't even sure we'd ever cross paths." He leaned forward, voice raw. "I swear I'm not going anywhere. It's surprising how much I want to be part of their lives. Tell me what I can do." She sighed, setting her cup down with a gentle clink. "They don't know about you yet, not really. They've asked questions, especially after that restaurant moment. They see your face on TV sometimes. They're not clueless." A flicker of recognition passed across his features. He pictured the girls at the table, how they'd looked at him with wide, curious eyes. "I want to meet them," he said softly. "Properly." Imani nodded. "They want that too, I think. But you have to move slowly. And more than anything, you have to protect them. I've tried so hard to keep them away from cameras, from gossip. Their lives are innocent, normal. They have no clue what being tied to a man like you might bring." He understood the weight of her words. Everything about his life was public. His success, his failures. Paparazzi would latch onto any scandal, and having 2 unknown daughters was a headline that could spiral out of control. They fell silent, both absorbing the magnitude of what lay ahead. Outside the cafe's windows, cars passed by. People drifted on sidewalks, living their everyday lives. But here, in this corner booth, an entire future balanced precariously on a single conversation. A muffled click near the front made Jonathan look up. A man in a ball cap hovered near the counter with a phone in hand, eyes darting their way. Jonathan stiffened. Paparazzi? It was hard to be sure, but the man seemed too interested. Imani followed his gaze and frowned. "Let's take the back exit," she murmured. "I don't want him snapping pictures for some gossip website." Jonathan signaled the waitress. They paid quickly, then slipped outside through a side door. A light drizzle had started, droplets clinging to Imani's hair. She huddled under the awning, scanning the street for a taxi. Jonathan moved beside her, trying to shield her from view. For a moment, he recalled how he used to shield her from the rain when they traveled together, how he always stood on the curbside. Familiar pangs of nostalgia tugged at his chest. "What now?" he asked. "Can I see them soon?" She pulled her phone out, checking the time. "I'll figure something out," she said quietly. "Just don't rush it. Layla and Leah might be overwhelmed if you come charging into their lives." He nodded, relieved that she wasn't outright refusing. "I understand." Then he lowered his voice. "And if the press starts digging, I'll do everything in my power to protect you and the girls." A yellow taxi slowed to the curb. Imani took a step toward it, eyes flicking back to him one last time. Her expression was conflicted but not entirely cold. "Don't hurt them," she warned, tone firm yet tinged with a hint of the gentleness he remembered. Jonathan held her gaze. "I promise." She slipped inside the cab, and it pulled away, taillights vanishing down the wet street. Jonathan stood there with the drizzle collecting in his hair, heart drumming with a strange mixture of hope and anxiety. He turned to go to his own car when his phone vibrated in his pocket. He fished it out, spotting the caller ID from his corporate board. The number flashed with urgency, and a chill ran through him. He was about to answer when he heard the phone ring a second time, intensifying that sense of alarm. Imani slipped away into a taxi, leaving Jonathan with a single directive: "Don't hurt them." Seconds later, his phone rings. This time it's from the board, and they sound panicked. Jonathan stood on the bustling sidewalk, phone pressed to his ear, the aftertaste of tension still lingering from his meeting with Imani. A storm of questions churned in his mind, about her, about the girls, and about whether his attempts at building a connection might come too late. But the voice on the other end of the line tore him abruptly back into the corporate battlefront. A board member's worried tone crackled through. Stocks had taken a sudden hit. There were rumors of leaked documents, speculation about financial instability. Jonathan asked for details, but they barely had any. "Come in right away," the board member insisted, his voice tight with urgency. "We're scheduling an emergency meeting." As soon as Jonathan ended the call, he stepped to the curb to hail his own ride. The taxi that screeched to a stop was no match for the swirl of thoughts in his head. He navigated the seatbelt with rushed hands, hardly noticing the driver's polite greeting. All he could think about was how precariously his life was balanced. One misstep, and he could lose the company he'd built from the ground up. Another misstep, and he could lose any chance of being a father to Layla and Leah. He arrived at his building, a sleek high-rise of glass and steel that reflected the sky like a mirror. Past the swish of automatic doors, he walked briskly across polished floors, ignoring the concerned stares from passing employees. The elevator ride to the executive level felt endless, each moment intensifying the weight on his shoulders. The boardroom was already full when he entered. A hush settled as soon as they saw him. At the head of the long table sat his CFO, an older man with worry lines etched deep across his forehead. On another side sat Richard Myers, a major shareholder who had a history of smiling one moment and maneuvering for power the next. His cordial nod in Jonathan's direction felt more like a challenge than a greeting. Jonathan cleared his throat. "I got here as fast as I could. Someone fill me in." The CFO stood, fiddling with a folder. "There's been a noticeable dip in share prices this morning. We suspect someone leaked internal data regarding potential expansions, ones we haven't even publicly announced. It's led to speculation and panic selling." Richard Myers spoke up with a sympathetic sigh. "I hate to see the company in turmoil like this. I'm sure everyone here does. We need strong, steady leadership now more than ever." He let the words hang, as though questioning whether Jonathan was that leader. Jonathan tightened his jaw. "And do we have any idea who might be behind the leak?" "Not yet," the CFO replied. "It could be a competitor, could be an inside job." A low murmur spread around the table. Jonathan recognized the anxiety in each pair of eyes. Acquisitions and expansions were normally cause for excitement, but if mishandled or leaked early, they signaled chaos. One board member, a stoic older woman named Ms. Yang, finally broke the tension. "We all know how quickly rumors can spiral. The question is, what's our immediate plan to stabilize the situation?" Jonathan's phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He ignored it. Another crisis, no doubt. He placed both palms flat on the table, scanning the worried faces. "First, we issue a measured statement to the press, clarifying that any talk of expansion is speculative. Second, we track down the source of these leaks. I don't care how covert we have to be. We find out who's sabotaging us." Across the table, Richard offered a thin smile. "I commend the decisive approach. But aren't there some personal matters you need to address before things get worse?" He feigned concern, but Jonathan knew better. News must have reached Richard's ears about the rumors swirling, something about secret children, a family no one had known existed. Jonathan's eyes flicked to Ms. Yang, who gave him the smallest nod of solidarity. Then he let out a slow breath. "My personal life won't affect my ability to lead this company," he said firmly. "Right now, we focus on the stock dive." A few board members exchanged uncertain glances, but no one openly challenged him. The CFO began outlining emergency strategies while the meeting pressed on. Jonathan stayed focused, scribbling notes and issuing instructions. Yet, beneath his calm demeanor, his mind whirled with images of Imani's tense stare and the little girls who could be his daughters. After nearly 2 hours, the board dispersed, leaving Jonathan alone with Richard and the CFO tidying their papers. Richard stepped closer with that same irritating, solicitous smile. "You know, I'd hate for any negative publicity to hurt the company, especially in such a vulnerable moment. Perhaps consider stepping back for a while, letting cooler heads handle the daily operations." Jonathan bristled. "Is that your polite way of suggesting I resign? Because that's never going to happen." Richard chuckled, a shallow sound that echoed off the glass walls. "Just offering options. Always best to keep an open mind." Before Jonathan could retort, Ms. Yang approached, lightly touching his arm. "We need your direction. Don't let Richard's posturing rattle you. But be careful. He's not above exploiting any weakness." Jonathan nodded, relieved to have at least one ally. He left the boardroom with a tightness in his chest. Once inside his private office, he sank into a leather chair. The city skyline beyond the massive windows seemed colder than usual, as though reminding him that power came with a price. Around midday, he forced himself to step away from the chaos. He scanned his phone for messages, half hoping to see something from Imani. Instead, he found a text from Marcus. "You should visit Imani's place soon. You need to show you're serious about being involved." Jonathan exhaled slowly. He typed back, "Agreed. I'll talk to her." Within the hour, he called Imani. Her voice on the other line was subdued, but not openly hostile. She said the twins would be at school until the afternoon, so if he wanted to come by, they could talk. Just the two of them. He thanked her and left the office behind, delegating urgent matters to Marcus, determined to buy himself one quiet afternoon away from the corporate firestorm. He found Imani's home without difficulty. It felt different stepping onto her front porch with a purpose rather than simply watching from his car. He stood there, summoning the nerve to knock, thinking how it felt eerily like approaching an entirely new world. When she opened the door, he saw the same wary look in her eyes. Still, she let him in. The living room was modest but cozy, soft, neutral walls, a few photographs of Layla and Leah in bright frames. His gaze lingered on those images. The girls wore matching pink dresses and held each other's hands, their smiles lighting up the frame. Imani followed his stare. "That was their birthday last year," she explained. "They'd insisted on the same outfit even though they fight sometimes about who wore which color best." Jonathan's chest tightened with emotion he wasn't used to feeling. "They look happy," he said quietly. "I'm glad you've built a life that lets them be that way." She motioned for him to sit. "It's been hard sometimes, but they're worth it." He took a seat on a simple couch, feeling uncharacteristically unsure of himself. "I want to help. I want to know them, not just from pictures or glimpses." Imani settled in an armchair across from him. "I'm letting you in because I don't want to deny them a father, if you're truly committed. But you have to realize that your business issues might spill over. Paparazzi, gossip. It'll all come down on them if you're not careful." Jonathan ran a hand across the back of his neck. "I know the risks. I'm already dealing with a crisis at work. There's someone on the board who might be fueling rumors for leverage. If this blows up, it could drag you and the kids into a very public storm." She lifted her chin. "Then maybe the question is, are you going to fight for them, or let it scare you off?" He nodded, letting a determined edge set in his voice. "I'm not running. Whatever it takes, I'll fight to protect all of you." They lapsed into a moment of quiet understanding. Jonathan noticed a bookshelf in the corner stocked with children's stories, small figurines scattered on top. The ordinary warmth of that home made him realize just how different his life had been since the divorce. Expensive galas, business deals, a lonely penthouse. None of it felt as grounded as this. "I know you're busy," she said finally, "so maybe let's set a time for you to meet the girls when they're home, properly. They'll be ecstatic or terrified. Maybe both." A flicker of a smile crossed Jonathan's face. "What about tomorrow afternoon? I could come by with something for them. Maybe have a little chat, see how they feel. I won't push." Imani thought for a moment. "Okay, but let me talk to them first. Explain who you are in a gentler way. They've asked questions. They're not clueless, even if I've been vague." He felt his heart lift. "Thank you," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "I appreciate the chance." They were interrupted by the distant hum of a school bus stopping on the street outside. Imani stood, glancing at the clock. "They're home earlier than I expected." A surge of panic and excitement flushed through him. "Do you want me to go before they come in?" She hesitated. "Yes. I think I need to talk to them without you here. I'll let them know about meeting you tomorrow." He nodded, not wanting to make this any harder. Gathering his coat, he moved toward the door. Footsteps pattered on the sidewalk, and he heard little voices outside. His chest tightened again at the sound. Imani opened the front door, peering out. "All right, girls, just give me one moment. Wait on the porch," she said gently. Layla and Leah could be heard giggling, apparently caught up in some small game. Jonathan yearned to see their faces up close, but now wasn't the time. He stepped onto the threshold, glancing over his shoulder at Imani. "Thanks again. Really." She gave a slow nod, eyes flicking outside where the girls waited. "I'll text you, all right?" "Sure." He dipped his head in a grateful gesture and was about to step fully out when she reached out to touch his arm. "Before you go," she began, her voice low, "there's something you should know." He turned, meeting her gaze. She looked torn, as if struggling to decide how much to reveal. "What is it?" she exhaled. "They already suspect you're their father, so don't vanish again." Jonathan pulled away from the curb outside Imani's home, her final words echoing through his mind. "They already suspect you're their father, so don't vanish again." The statement hung over him like a vow he couldn't break. He drove in near silence, replaying the image of the girls waiting on the porch, their small voices drifting through the air. The tightness in his chest told him there was no turning back. He'd made a silent promise to stay, and this time he intended to keep it. The next morning, any illusions of handling his personal life quietly shattered. Marcus burst into Jonathan's office, phone in hand, eyes filled with dread. "Have you seen the headlines?" he demanded. "They're already out there." Jonathan's heart sank. "Headlines about you having a secret family," Marcus said, his voice grim. He tapped the screen, showing articles bearing provocative titles like CEO Jonathan Blake's Hidden Children and Sources Claim Billionaire Hides Twins. Jonathan felt the blood drain from his face. This was the very scenario he feared, the press circling like vultures, ready to broadcast any whiff of scandal. By mid-morning, phone calls and emails flooded in from board members, clients, and even old acquaintances who suddenly remembered they had Jonathan's number. Everyone asked the same question. "Is it true?" He fielded each inquiry with carefully measured words, refusing to confirm or deny anything. "Speculation," he told them, "malicious rumors," the usual swirl of gossip that followed a high-profile CEO. Privately, he reeled. If the tabloids dug deeper, they would find Imani's address, photographs of Layla and Leah, details of a story that was far too delicate to be used as clickbait. Determined to protect them, Jonathan hired a small but reliable security team. He instructed them to guard Imani's home discreetly, stay out of sight, and intervene only if paparazzi or reporters got too close. He couldn't bear the idea of the twins being harassed on their doorstep. That same afternoon, he worked up the nerve to call Imani. As soon as she picked up, he heard the tension in her voice. "What did you do?" she asked, her tone sharp with alarm. "Are you the one who leaked this, or—" "Of course not," he cut in. "I'd never do that. I hate that it's gone public. I'm doing everything I can to keep them off your front lawn." Imani exhaled, a shaky sound over the line. "Paparazzi haven't shown up yet, but we've had a few strange cars driving by slowly. The girls are scared and I'm furious." Jonathan pressed the phone tighter to his ear. "I'm sorry. This is exactly what I wanted to avoid. I'm arranging protection so no one bothers you. I'll pay whatever it costs." She hesitated, considering, then relented with a tired sigh. "Fine, if it means keeping the girls safe." A trace of sorrow crept into her voice. "They're too young to deal with flash photography and invasive questions." "I swear I'll do whatever it takes," he murmured. "Just hang in there." The next day, an invitation arrived on Jonathan's desk, a high-profile corporate summit. He recognized the sponsor's emblem, also noticing who was listed as one of the keynote speakers. Richard Myers. Jonathan's stomach twisted. If anyone would relish turning a personal scandal into corporate ammunition, it was Richard. Jonathan had no doubt he'd be skewered with pointed questions about ethics and leadership, but refusing the invitation would only confirm suspicions. With the board on edge and rumors mounting, he felt cornered. He accepted, silently vowing to stand his ground. He shared the news with Marcus, who pressed his lips together in worry. "We need a game plan, Jonathan. Richard is going to use your personal issues as ammo against you. He'll try to paint you as unstable, a risk to investors." Jonathan gazed at the city skyline through his office window, feeling weary. "We'll focus on the data, on the company's track record. Then we'll address the gossip head-on. I can't hide from it forever." Marcus nodded, though his brows remained furrowed. "There's also Ms. Yang. She's been quietly supporting you. She might help us expose Richard's own shady dealings if the opportunity arises." "Good," Jonathan said. "We'll need every advantage we can get." That evening, Jonathan arranged another private meeting with Imani. She arrived at a low-key diner near her neighborhood, wearing a coat that seemed to swallow her slender frame. Jonathan studied her face, noticing faint lines of stress, signs that the sudden media interest weighed heavily on her. "I heard about the summit," she said, sliding into the booth across from him. "You think Richard has something to do with these leaks?" Jonathan nodded slowly. "He's a master at ferreting out weaknesses. Having a secret family is the perfect scandal to exploit." "And the girls," she whispered. "They're the ones who'll suffer if the press goes wild. We have to keep them out of sight." He laid his hands flat on the table. "Agreed. Until we calm the media storm, I don't want them anywhere near reporters. If we need to, we'll pull them out of school for a bit. Hire tutors, whatever it takes." She fixed him with an intense stare. "They love their school, their friends. I can't just uproot them. That's why this is so devastating. They have normal lives, and suddenly it's threatened because of who you are." Jonathan's throat tightened. "I know, and I'm sorry. But let's be realistic. If cameras show up at their school, we'll have no choice." She rubbed her forehead. "I hate this." He felt helpless. "So do I. But I won't abandon them. If you need resources, money, connections, just say the word. I'll make it happen." Imani leaned back with a weary nod, then changed the subject to something lighter. She spoke about how Layla and Leah had asked if their dad was the man from the restaurant. Imani had finally started telling them the truth. A small smile tugged at the corner of Jonathan's mouth when he heard how the girls reacted. Cautious, surprised, a bit excited, and full of questions. It gave him a flicker of hope in the midst of all the chaos. He left the diner more resolved than ever to protect the fragile bond just beginning to form between him and his daughters. For a moment, he forgot the tensions at work, the looming corporate summit, and the paparazzi that lurked behind every rumor. That calm broke the next day when yet another wave of accusations hit the media. This time it wasn't just about the twins, it was about Jonathan's leadership. Anonymous sources claimed he manipulated company finances, painting him as unethical, reckless. Jonathan sat at his office desk, staring at the swirling allegations on his screen. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. Board members demanded explanations. Investors threatened to pull out. The rumor mill kept spinning, fueled by shadowy insiders feeding the press. Even Marcus, loyal as he was, looked grim. "We've got to counter these claims, or the company will hemorrhage money. It might even cost you your position." "That's exactly what Richard wants," Jonathan muttered. "He's trying to drive me out, using whatever scandal he can dredge up." Marcus lowered his voice. "He's found your weak spot, the girls. He thinks you'll be too distracted to fight back." Jonathan stared at the screen a moment longer, heart pounding. Then, with a burst of determination, he slammed the laptop shut. "Enough," he said, standing up. "I'm not giving in. I'll show up at that summit, defend my record, and protect my family all at once." In the solitude of his penthouse that night, Jonathan found himself scrolling through photos of Layla and Leah Imani had discreetly shared. The girls in bright summer dresses, heads tilted as they laughed, or wearing goofy costumes for a school play. Each photo tightened the knot in Jonathan's chest, reminding him what truly mattered. He set his phone down and noticed the glow of the city outside, those towers he once climbed in pursuit of business success. Now they only reminded him of the stakes he faced. The ring of his phone startled him. He picked it up, hoping it might be Imani. Instead, it was a generic ID, probably another anxious board member. He let it go to voicemail, choosing instead to savor a few more seconds of calm. His resolve hardened. He would attend the summit, face down Richard, and keep the girls safe from becoming fodder for tabloids. If this fight cost him everything, so be it. A father protects his children, even if it means risking the empire he built. Just as he was about to set the phone aside, a text from Imani lit up the screen. "We can't hide forever. Do what you must. Just don't break their hearts." Jonathan adjusted his collar, standing backstage in the crowded conference hall while the din of voices drifted around him. This high-profile summit had promised to be a defining moment for his company, but it felt more like walking into an arena where enemies lay in wait. His suit felt too tight around the shoulders, or maybe it was the tension pressing down on him. Despite his discomfort, he kept his posture steady, determined to project composure. Marcus stood beside him, clutching a clipboard that listed the schedule of speakers. "Richard's up first," Marcus said under his breath. "Brace yourself. He's probably going to throw jabs at your personal life." Jonathan inhaled, counting to 3 before letting the air escape. "I can handle Richard," he muttered. "I just need to keep calm." A woman with a headset signaled for them to take their places. Jonathan stepped forward, ignoring the gnawing pit in his stomach. He forced his thoughts away from the photos and rumors plastered across news sites, each headline speculating about his secret twins and scandalous personal life. Every passing day made it more difficult to protect Imani and the girls from the press. Once he reached a hidden corner of the stage, he saw Richard Myers strolling out under the bright lights. A thunder of polite applause rose from the audience, business leaders, journalists, and VIPs from various industries. Richard, ever the showman, paused at the podium, scanning the crowd with feigned humility. "Good morning," Richard began, flashing a perfect grin. "I'm honored to speak on corporate ethics and leadership today, but as many of us know, a leader's personal integrity is often inseparable from the reputation of the company." His voice dripped with pointed emphasis on personal integrity. Jonathan's jaw clenched. He had expected this. Even so, hearing Richard's veiled accusations in such a public forum made the hairs on his neck prickle with anger. Richard continued to paint a rosy picture of how transparent leaders built strong businesses. Then, voice dripping with concern, he added, "Some CEOs unfortunately find themselves in precarious situations when private matters overshadow professional obligations." He stopped just short of naming Jonathan, but the implication hung heavily in the air. In the backstage gloom, Marcus murmured, "Stay focused on facts. Don't let him bait you." Jonathan nodded, eyes fixed on the floor. He knew his turn would come next, and he'd have to stand on that very stage, facing not just the corporate crowd but a barrage of media cameras. The tension in his shoulders wouldn't let up. Finally, Richard ended with a flourish, stepping away from the podium to polite applause. He left behind an undercurrent of speculation, the audience abuzz with half-finished thoughts about scandal and secrets. As he passed Jonathan, Richard let a small, triumphant grin tug at the corner of his mouth. Jonathan forced his own features to remain impassive. Stepping forward onto the stage, Jonathan faced rows of curious eyes. Reporters clicked cameras at regular intervals, the strobe of flashes bright even under the overhead lights. But he cleared his throat and spoke in a measured tone, choosing to focus first on the company's achievements, reaffirming the strength and stability of his leadership team. He highlighted recent milestones, product expansions, increased revenue, philanthropic efforts. The audience listened, some nodding, but he couldn't ignore the sideways glances from a few journalists, clearly hoping he would address the swirl of rumors directly. "We've always believed," he said, "that ethical business practice goes beyond the office. It extends to how we respect our communities and the people who depend on us." He saw Richard standing off to the side, arms folded, watching intently. Jonathan understood the pressure to respond to the personal attacks, so he took a breath, letting his gaze sweep across the assembled crowd. "As for the speculation surrounding my personal life," he began, voice calm yet firm, "I'm aware of the rumors. I ask that you remember we live in a world where privacy is often invaded. I'll say this. My priority is and always will be ensuring that anyone connected to me is treated with dignity and respect." A murmur rippled through the audience. The subtler members nodded or scribbled notes. The more aggressive reporters narrowed their eyes, awaiting an opening to pounce. Jonathan concluded his remarks with a sharp pivot back to corporate matters, wrapping up with a note on transparency and accountability. Polite applause followed, but the tension hardly eased. The moment he stepped off stage, microphones materialized, jostling him. A cluster of reporters had bypassed security, hungry for a statement. He held up his hands to ward off the press of bodies. "Mr. Blake, is it true you have secret children?" one shouted over the others. "Are you trying to hide them to protect your career? Will this scandal force you to step down?" Their questions came in machine gun bursts. Jonathan swallowed a surge of irritation. On the periphery, he spotted Marcus waving for security, but a paparazzo slipped through the chaos, snapping photos with an invasive flash that nearly blinded him. "Enough," Jonathan said, keeping his voice cool. "I'm here to talk about the summit's purpose, corporate innovation, ethical leadership. My personal affairs are not the topic today. Isn't personal integrity key to ethical leadership?" The paparazzo thrust his phone forward, trying to record Jonathan's response. Jonathan caught sight of Richard in the background, quietly observing the spectacle with clear satisfaction. That sight churned Jonathan's stomach, but he squared his shoulders, refusing to lose composure. Before he could reply, a young security guard muscled the reporters aside, creating a path for him to exit. Jonathan broke away, ignoring the shouted questions that pursued him down the hallway. Cameras continued clicking frantically. He found a quiet corridor behind the main conference room. Marcus appeared by his side, shaking his head in dismay. "That was a scene. You okay?" "Fine," Jonathan said, though his pulse throbbed in his temples. "Richard is milking this, but I won't let him push me into a meltdown." Marcus sighed. "Yeah, well, the internet doesn't need a meltdown. Even a hint of anger from you will become tomorrow's headline." They made their way to a private lounge area set aside for speakers. A half-dozen chairs and a small table offered a brief refuge from the chaos outside. Jonathan collapsed into one of the chairs, running a hand over his face. He couldn't stop thinking about Imani's words, and the look on her face when she warned him not to break the girls' hearts. It fueled a quiet resolve not to let the scandal spin out of control. He was a grown man who could handle the fallout, but the twins were too young to be hounded by tabloids. Miles away at her workplace, Imani was no stranger to confrontation either. Rumors about her having a secret romance with a billionaire had filtered into her social circle. A few colleagues whispered thinly veiled criticisms, insinuating she might be using Jonathan for money or status. She felt eyes on her wherever she went, and it stung. Despite her resolve, she found her composure cracking whenever she thought about how it might affect the twins. She pushed through her day, answering emails and fielding calls with forced calm. By afternoon, she was on the verge of tears. At the summit, Jonathan stayed until the final panel discussion ended, making every effort to appear unwavering. In truth, he felt the day's tension gnawing at him. Every conversation with other executives seemed laced with subtle references to his predicament. He watched Richard deliver a closing statement full of smooth remarks about how personal conduct shapes corporate fortunes. Jonathan could practically taste the smugness in his tone. The moment it was over, Jonathan headed for the exit, Marcus trailing behind. Cameras flashed once more in the lobby. He ducked away, stepping outside into the late afternoon light. Cool air hit his face, and he exhaled with relief at having escaped the staged politeness of the conference rooms. He had just reached the sidewalk when his phone vibrated. He glanced at the caller ID, Imani. His pulse sped up, anxious that maybe more reporters had shown up at her door. He answered quickly. Her voice burst through, taut with panic. They found the school. Reporters showed up at the girls' school. Jonathan could still hear the echoes of applauding conference guests in his mind when Imani's urgent call snapped him into a new reality. Reporters had shown up at the twins' school. Every other concern vanished the instant he heard the strain in her voice. He and Marcus hopped into the waiting car, telling the driver to break every traffic rule necessary. Anxiety rippled through his veins, each minute feeling like an eternity. By the time they pulled up in front of the modest brick building, the school day was already over. Parents formed small huddles on the sidewalk, their expressions tense. Jonathan spotted a few individuals with cameras trying to be discreet. The presence of even one paparazzo was too much for him. Gritting his teeth, he got out of the car, Marcus close behind, and rushed toward the entrance. A security guard at the main doors held up a hand, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "You can't just barge in, sir," he said, recognizing Jonathan's face from the onslaught of recent headlines. "Please step aside." Before Jonathan could protest, Imani appeared from inside, gently escorting Layla and Leah in front of her. The girls looked unsettled, their wide eyes darting around the small crowd. Jonathan's heart nearly broke seeing their confusion. He stepped closer, ignoring the cameras that clicked nearby like vultures waiting for carnage. Imani's tone was brisk but protective. "We're leaving," she told the guard quietly, maintaining an air of control for the girl's sake. Then her dark gaze landed on Jonathan. "They cornered me in the parking lot," she muttered, voice taut with anger, "asking questions about paternity, even trying to snap pictures of the twins. Some staff members helped us get inside." Jonathan swallowed hard. "Let's get them home safely. Please, let me give you a ride. I've got security with me." Imani studied him for a moment, reading the genuine worry in his eyes. Without another word, she nodded, gently guiding the twins along. Marcus stepped forward, shielding them from cameras and ushering everyone toward the car. Flashes burst, voices shouting. Leah looked up at Jonathan with a tremor in her voice. "Why are they taking pictures of us?" Layla clutched her sister's hand, searching for reassurance in every adult face around her. Jonathan leaned low, trying to keep his words steady. "They're just curious. But we're leaving, okay? Don't worry, you're safe." It was a hollow assurance, and he knew it. As soon as they got the girls buckled into the back seat with Imani, Jonathan slid in next to Marcus. The driver took off before any more reporters could press their lenses against the windows. Silence settled over them, broken only by the hum of the engine. Imani rubbed one of the girls' shoulders. "It's all right," she repeated, more for her own sake than theirs. She glanced sideways at Jonathan, anger and fear mingling in her features. "This is exactly what I wanted to avoid." Jonathan sat rigidly, hands clenched. He remembered the days after his parents' divorce. Reporters had hounded his father, a minor politician at the time, leaving Jonathan feeling exposed. The last thing he ever wanted was for Layla and Leah to experience that same sense of helplessness. "I'm sorry," he murmured, not really knowing if he was apologizing for the past or the present chaos. "I'm trying to shut this down." Imani let out a harsh breath. "How?" "It's out there now. Everyone's talking." No one spoke for the remainder of the drive. Tension hovered over every heart. When they arrived at Imani's home, a security guard Jonathan had hired stood watch. No paparazzi were in sight at that moment, but they all knew it wouldn't stay quiet for long. Inside, the girls moved robotically, as if they couldn't shake the unsettling event at school. Imani led them to the living room, urged them to sit, and offered water. Jonathan trailed behind, his presence as uncertain as ever in that small home. A heavy silence blanketed them. Finally, Layla, the more outspoken of the two, raised her gaze. "Why were they calling you our dad?" she asked, voice trembling. "Aren't you just that man from the restaurant?" Jonathan exchanged a glance with Imani before he carefully crouched down, getting on their eye level. "Layla, Leah, I know this might be confusing," he began softly. "Your mom and we used to be married a long time ago, and I recently found out that I'm your father." Both girls stared at him, eyes searching, fear flickering behind their curiosity. Leah's lower lip quivered. "Why didn't you come before?" she whispered. Jonathan felt like every word was slicing through him. "I didn't know about you," he replied, voice strained. "If I had, I would have come sooner. I'm so sorry." Imani stood behind the couch, arms folded defensively across her chest. She didn't contradict him, didn't add anything, letting him struggle through this delicate confession. He reached for one of the girl's hands, though he stopped short, unsure if it would be welcome. "You're not scared of us, right?" Layla asked, blinking away tears. The question shocked Jonathan. "Never," he said with quiet conviction. "I'm only worried about people who want to take your pictures and invade your privacy. I'm worried about keeping you both safe, because—" He paused, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Because I'm your dad, and that's what dads do. They protect their kids." Leah frowned, remembering the frightening scene at school. "So, now what?" Imani gently slipped into the conversation. "For now, you two are going to stay home for a bit. We'll figure out how to keep the reporters away." She paused, glancing at Jonathan. "We might even need to pull you from that school entirely, just until things calm down." Both girls' faces fell. They loved their school, their teachers, their friends. Jonathan could see the heartbreak in their eyes at the thought of leaving their familiar routines. A wave of guilt crashed over him, stronger than anything he'd felt before. His successes, his public identity, had become a source of pain for them. Eventually, Imani guided the girls upstairs to rest, urging them to play or read until dinner. Jonathan offered to step out so they could have space, but Imani stopped him with a gesture. She waited until the twins' footsteps faded. "Can we talk?" she said quietly, her voice tight. He nodded, and they moved to the small kitchen. Afternoon sunlight slanted through the window, illuminating the tension etched on her face. He leaned against the counter, trying to steady himself. "I'm so sorry," he said for what felt like the 100th time. "I never wanted them to be afraid." Imani raked a hand through her hair. "I know, but it's happening, and we can't pretend otherwise." She closed her eyes for a moment. "Look, I have to consider something. Maybe I should take the girls out of the city, at least until the scandal dies down." A cold wave of panic washed over Jonathan. "Wait, leave the city entirely?" "That might be the only way," she insisted, voice trembling with frustration. "I can't risk them being ambushed like this again." He swallowed, not wanting to imagine them disappearing. After all these lost years, he'd just found them. "But how will I see them if you're gone?" He tried to control the edge in his tone, but desperation bled through. She pressed her lips together, clearly torn. "I don't know. Maybe you can visit once it's safe, or we can talk online. But I can't let them live in constant fear, Jonathan." His mind spun. It felt like his life was falling apart at every seam. The company under threat, the board doubting him, the media swirling with rumors. And now the prospect that the only family he had left might leave for good to escape the storm that followed his name. "I get that," he said finally, voice rough. "But please, at least let me try to fix this. Let me get it under control so you don't have to uproot them." "Can you, though?" she asked, desperation etched into the lines at the corners of her eyes. "These reporters will do anything for a story. Your rival at work might be fueling half of this madness. Do you even have a plan?" Jonathan rubbed the back of his neck. "I'm working on it. I have attorneys trying to issue restraining orders for paparazzi, and I'll confront my corporate rival. He's not untouchable. It's just complicated." Imani sighed, glancing toward the stairs where the twins had gone. "Don't drag your feet. If this escalates, I'm out of here." She gave him a long, searching look. "I won't risk my daughter's safety for your fight." He couldn't argue. She had every right to protect them. "I promise I'll figure something out fast." He stayed for a few more minutes, discussing potential ways to handle the media. They couldn't settle on a perfect solution, but at least they talked. A couple of times they lowered their voices, worried the girls might overhear. Their hushed strategies did little to quiet the worry in Jonathan's mind. Eventually, he left the house, heart heavier than ever. Marcus waited in the car, looking concerned. As Jonathan slid into the passenger seat, he closed his eyes and took a few shaky breaths. "How bad is it?" Marcus asked softly, starting the engine. "Bad," Jonathan replied, voice hollow. "Imani's thinking about running again. I can't let that happen." Marcus offered a small nod of understanding. "We'll find a way. You're not alone in this." They drove off, neither speaking until they reached the skyscraper housing Jonathan's office. He braced himself for more calls from anxious board members and prying reporters, but the biggest ache in his chest was the idea that Imani and the twins might vanish if he couldn't contain the media frenzy. That night, Jonathan holed up in his penthouse, pacing near the windows that offered a view of the glittering city. The metropolis he had once revered felt suffocating, each tower a looming presence that seemed to mock his predicament. He pored over legal documents, read strategy proposals from PR consultants, and tried to quell the sense of impending doom. Hours later, near midnight, his phone buzzed. The ID on the screen was unknown. With a flicker of apprehension, he checked the message. It said, "I have evidence that can save you. Meet me tomorrow night." Jonathan found himself sitting alone in the back seat of a hired car, headlights sweeping across deserted streets as he neared the address sent by that unknown number. The city glowed in the distance, and each tower reminded him of how easily ambition could become a cage. He checked his phone again, rereading the cryptic text. "I have evidence that can save you. Meet me tomorrow night." It felt surreal, like stepping into a detective novel rather than his own life. He glanced toward Marcus in the driver's seat. They had decided not to bring a chauffeur or extra security this time, wanting to keep the meeting under the radar. If it was a setup, Jonathan preferred it be as discreet as possible. Still, a constant hum of nerves kept him on edge. He tugged at his collar, wishing for a breath of cooler air. They pulled up outside a dimly lit bar at the end of a narrow side street. Neon letters, half burnt out, spelled something that might once have read, "The High Note." Music thumped low inside. The sidewalk was mostly empty, a single street lamp flickering overhead. Marcus cut the engine, and they exchanged a tense look. "You're sure about this?" Marcus asked, voice hushed. "No," Jonathan admitted, stepping out anyway. "But if there's a chance it could clear my name and end Richard's sabotage, I have to check it out." The inside of the bar smelled of stale beer and chipped varnish. A handful of patrons sat hunched over drinks, casting the occasional glance at the newcomers. Colored lights blinked from a small stage where an ancient jukebox droned a sad tune. Jonathan spotted a lone figure in a dark hoodie at a corner table, face half hidden by the dimness. He and Marcus approached cautiously. Without speaking, the figure tilted their head, gesturing for Jonathan to sit. Marcus stood nearby, arms folded, clearly ready to intervene if something went wrong. Jonathan eased into the chair opposite the stranger, scanning for any sign of weapons or a trap. The hooded person produced a battered folder, sliding it across the sticky tabletop. "In there," came a low voice, "is what you need to prove Richard's behind your company leaks. And more." Jonathan glanced at the file, adrenaline flooding him. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. "My identity doesn't matter," the stranger said, voice muffled. What matters is that Richard Myers has used offshore accounts and shell companies to hide illegal activities. He's orchestrated your scandal to drive down your stock value and push you out. Once you're gone, he'll swoop in and take control. Jonathan's heart pounded. So these documents show that? They show enough to start an investigation. The hooded figure placed a gloved hand on the folder, as though reluctant to let go. Signatures tying Richard directly to those secret accounts, large sums suddenly vanishing and reappearing in off-the-books deals. The paper trail's there. You just need to confirm it's real. Marcus stepped closer, eyes locked on the folder. Why are you helping us? The stranger hesitated. Let's say I got burned by Richard's methods. This is my way of making sure he doesn't get away with it again. Then, in a single fluid motion, they rose. Check the docs, decide for yourself, but be careful. Richard doesn't play fair. Before Jonathan could press for more, the figure brushed past them, disappearing into a side exit. Marcus made to follow, but Jonathan put a hand on his arm. Let them go, he murmured, flipping open the folder. He caught a glimpse of spreadsheets, account numbers, grainy copies of passports. His pulse thumped faster. Without waiting, they headed to the car. The stale bar light faded behind them. Back on the deserted street, Marcus started the engine, and Jonathan's hands trembled slightly as he examined the papers in the passing glow of each street lamp. By the time they reached Jonathan's penthouse, a quiet excitement had taken root in his chest. Marcus parked, and they took the elevator upstairs in tense silence. In the living room, they laid out the documents on a coffee table. It looks legit, Marcus remarked, eyes scanning page after page. Dates align with when the leak started. Transactions lead back to shell companies we suspected might be tied to Richard. Jonathan sank onto the sofa, adrenaline still kicking. If we can authenticate these records, we can expose him. We can prove he's behind the sabotage. They worked late into the night, cross-referencing details. When the sun crept over the skyline, Jonathan finally set aside the last sheet. He felt something he hadn't in a long while. Hope, bright and pulsing. If Richard's corruption was exposed, maybe the tabloids and stock panic would die down. Maybe the pressure on Imani and the twins would ease. The next day, Jonathan received a cautious yet somewhat encouraging text from Imani. She said the girls were calmer now that they weren't attending school, though they missed their friends desperately. Their teacher had agreed to send them assignments at home, and a neighbor checked in regularly to help them stay occupied. Imani ended with, "If you really can end this, do it fast." Buoyed by the potential lifeline in those documents, Jonathan arranged a visit with Imani that afternoon. She met him in the living room, the twins upstairs, presumably playing with something to distract themselves from the madness outside. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes. Even so, she greeted him with less frost in her tone than usual. "I'm giving you the benefit of the doubt," she admitted, "but each day I see more headlines and my resolve to leave gets stronger." Jonathan gently set a hand on her arm, searching her eyes. "Imani, I have evidence now. Enough to take down the man fueling these rumors. If I can make a public statement, show the board the truth about Richard, this scandal might finally turn around." She studied his face, and for once, he saw a flicker of tentative optimism in her expression. "And the girls?" she asked. He gave a slow nod. "They deserve a normal life. No cameras chasing them, no reporters hounding you for quotes. That's what I'm fighting for." Just then, the girls peeked around the corner. Layla clutched a stuffed animal while Leah hovered behind her. Jonathan smiled gently, beckoning them forward. "Hey," he said, kneeling to their level. "How are you two holding up?" Layla fiddled with the stuffed animal's ear. "We're bored," she said. "We can't go to school or the park. Mom says it's too risky." Jonathan winced at the reality they were living. "What if we do something fun together just for a little while?" he suggested, glancing at Imani for permission. "Could go to the park if we're careful, or maybe somewhere else less crowded. I'll have security keep the paparazzi away." The girls exchanged hopeful looks. Imani pursed her lips, hesitant. but finally relented. "Just be extra cautious. One camera and we're out of there." A few hours later, they arrived at a quiet park on the outskirts of the city, courtesy of Jonathan's driver, who looped around to ensure no reporters had tailed them. The playground was nearly empty, save for a couple of toddlers and a watchful parent. Jonathan's security team lingered discreetly at a distance, eyes peeled for any suspicious onlookers. Layla and Leah skipped across the grass, apparently relieved to be outdoors. Jonathan walked alongside Imani, feeling a strange warmth bloom in his chest each time he heard the girls laugh. For a moment, as the wind stirred the leaves overhead, he felt normal, like a father simply watching his kids play. He found himself pushing Layla on a swing gently so she could feel the breeze without losing control. Leah tugged on Imani's sleeve, wanting help to climb a low tree branch. In the lull of that moment, Jonathan caught Imani's eye and saw something soft there, a glimpse of the old closeness they once shared. After the girls, tired of running around, they settled on a bench near the playground's edge, sipping from water bottles Jonathan had brought along. Imani and Jonathan found a spot under a tall oak. He felt a rush of memories, days when they dreamed about having children, about traveling the world, building a life hand in hand. Fate had taken them down different roads, but he hoped they could still forge some kind of family bond. "I never stopped thinking about you," he said quietly, surprising even himself with the admission. "But I got so wrapped up in building my empire that I let you slip away. And if these past weeks have shown me anything, it's that I need to be there for our daughters, no matter what." She lowered her gaze. "We both made mistakes. We both let things get between us. My fear, your ambition." She exhaled. "But I see you trying now, and I can't say I hate it." Before he could answer, a flicker of movement caught his eye at the edge of the park. One of his security guys tensed, speaking urgently into a small earpiece. Jonathan's heart sank. Paparazzi? He could see a car idling, a camera lens poking out the window. "Time to go," he muttered to Imani, jaw tight. She nodded, annoyance flashing across her face. The fragile peace shattered in an instant. They hurried back to the waiting car with the twins, shielding them from any possible angles. The driver took off, guided by radio updates from security to avoid the trailing vehicle. The girls huddled together in the back seat, a new wave of worry creasing their small brows. Jonathan exchanged a glance with Imani. They both realized this was no way to live, forever looking over their shoulders. Back at Imani's home, Jonathan sat with Marcus late into the evening, scanning the documents once more. Ms. Yang, one of the few sympathetic voices on the board, had agreed to look at the evidence privately. If she and a few other key players believed him, they could confront Richard. That confrontation would be Jonathan's best shot at stopping the scandal and keeping Imani and the twins from running again. Shortly after midnight, Jonathan's phone chimed. He expected a message from Ms. Yang, but instead, the text read, "If you think you can ruin me, think again." Jonathan lowered his phone, pulse skittering from the text that read, "If you think you can ruin me, think again." He stood by the tall windows of his penthouse, looking out over the sleeping city, lights shimmering like distant stars. The night felt eerily quiet, as if the city itself held its breath. Marcus watched him from across the room, sensing the weight of that threat. "We have to assume it's from Richard," Marcus said, his voice subdued. "He knows we have something on him." Jonathan nodded. "He's not one to scare easily. This means he's feeling cornered and dangerous." He crossed the plush living room, stepping around scattered papers and printouts that documented Richard's secret offshore accounts. In a neat stack lay the folder from that hooded informant, everything carefully catalogued. Enough evidence to topple Richard if revealed at the right time. Marcus rubbed his temples. "With tomorrow's board meeting, we need a plan. You can't just walk in and slam these documents on the table. We need to confirm their authenticity, or Richard will tear them apart." Jonathan bristled. "Ms. Yang is making calls to a forensic accountant. We'll have partial verification by morning." He paused, glancing at the city lights. "I have no choice. If I sit on this information, Richard's sabotage continues. The stock dips, the press devours me, and Imani will feel forced to leave town with the twins." Marcus stood a moment, weighing the risk. "Then we go all in," he said, voice resolute. "Expose Richard, or risk losing everything." Early the next morning, the tension in Jonathan's chest refused to subside. Each email he opened carried more bad news. Rumors of internal strife leaked to the press, investors threatening to withdraw. He fought to keep calm, dreading what else might surface before the day was done. Midway through sorting through the deluge of messages, Ms. Yang called. Her tone was clipped. "Our forensic team says the documents are real enough to raise serious questions about Richard's activities. I'm going to rally the board members who still have some faith in you." Jonathan thanked her, a wave of guarded relief washing over him. Yet a part of him couldn't help but wonder how far Richard would go to maintain control. He recalled the text. "If you think you can ruin me, think again." By lunchtime, Jonathan found himself pacing in his office while Marcus updated him on swirling rumors. A new article had popped up claiming unethical leadership under Jonathan's watch, citing anonymous sources. Another boasted that a major client was reconsidering its partnership. Nothing Jonathan could confirm, but it all stoked the flames of doubt around him. He mulled over calling Imani to reassure her, but the phone rang before he could. The receptionist announced that Richard was in the lobby, demanding to speak. Jonathan stiffened, nodding for security to let him up. When Richard finally strode in, the tension was palpable. He wore a crisp suit and that polished smile Jonathan had grown to hate. Leaning casually against the doorframe, he shrugged off the guard's presence, as though he owned the place. "Always a pleasure, Blake," Richard drawled, stepping into the office. His gaze flicked around at the scattered paperwork. "Been busy, I see." Jonathan forced himself to remain calm. "What do you want?" Richard heaved an exaggerated sigh. "Just a friendly warning. You're playing a dangerous game. If you make wild accusations at the board meeting, you'll only humiliate yourself. My lawyers will bury you in defamation suits." Jonathan squared his shoulders. "Is that all?" "For now," Richard replied with a thin smile. "But I advise you to consider your position. Step down gracefully, spare yourself further embarrassment. Leave with a shred of dignity, before your personal fiasco drags the company deeper under." Rage flashed in Jonathan's eyes, but he held it back. "I'm not stepping down." Richard shrugged, a smug tilt of his head. "Your funeral." With that, he offered a curt nod and headed out, footsteps echoing down the corridor. Marcus emerged from the corner, tension in his face. "He's afraid you'll use the documents. He's trying to bait you." Jonathan nodded, lips pressed tight. "He's not just trying. He's threatening me in plain sight. We press on. Show the board what we have." He paused, glancing at the time. Less than 24 hours remained until the meeting. "I only hope it's enough." Afternoon drifted into evening and Jonathan's phone buzzed with a text from Imani. "Girls are anxious. Layla's having nightmares about strangers at the door. Do something." The simple plea hit Jonathan like a punch to the gut. He stared at the words, remembering the bright hope in the twins' eyes, the fragile trust blossoming between them. Each day the media storm raged. That trust stood on shakier ground. He slipped out of the office and drove straight to Imani's home, ignoring the pile of tasks left undone. When he arrived, he found Imani in the living room, hugging Layla tight while Leah hovered nearby with worry etched on her small face. The windows were drawn, security stationed outside. The place felt more like a bunker than a home. Imani glanced up, relief flickering through her expression. "They can't sleep," she whispered. Leah's calmer, but Layla can't stop thinking about the cameras and strangers. Jonathan knelt next to the couch, meeting Layla's eyes. "Hey, kiddo," he said softly. I'm sorry you're scared, but I promise we're all here to keep you safe. Leah eyed him carefully. Mom says you're trying to fix it, she said. But when? Jonathan exchanged a heavy look with Imani, then turned to the girls. Tomorrow, I have a big meeting. After that, things should start to get better. I know it's hard to believe, but I'm doing everything I can. Layla sniffled. I just want to see my friends again. The simple statement felt like a dagger. All the spreadsheets, negotiations, and legal moves seemed so hollow compared to a child's desire for normalcy. Jonathan tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Soon, I hope, he whispered. Imani stood, beckoning him into the hallway while the girls retreated to their room. She kept her voice low. If your plan doesn't work, I have to take them away for a while. I hate it, but I can't watch them live like this. Jonathan nodded, an ache in his throat. I know, but trust me. Tomorrow, Richard's done. After that, we'll handle the press. Her eyes lingered on him a moment. There was exhaustion, but also a glimmer of faith. I'll give you time, but please, don't fail us. He left the house, heart heavy. The next hours blurred. He barely slept, too busy confirming final details with Ms. Yang and ensuring the documents were ready for the board. Each time he dozed, visions of Layla's tear-streaked face surfaced, urging him to stand firm. When morning came, an undercurrent of grim determination guided him. Marcus led the way to the executive boardroom, documents tucked in a discreet briefcase. Jonathan wore a steely expression, bracing for battle. The building thrummed with tension. Employees sensed something big was about to unfold. Inside, the board members settled around the long table. Richard sat near one end, a small smirk resting on his face. Ms. Yang caught Jonathan's eye, giving a near imperceptible nod. He inhaled deeply, preparing to present the evidence. This was his last chance to redeem himself in the eyes of the company and to protect his family. Yet just as he was about to speak, a commotion erupted in the corridor. Two employees bustled in, cell phones in hand, frantic worry on their faces. One of them sputtered, "Breaking news!" Her voice trembled as she forced the words out. "It's about Jonathan Blake!" A collective hush fell. Jonathan's stomach twisted. He locked eyes with Marcus, who quickly pulled out his own phone. A fresh wave of dread washed over him as he anticipated more scandal. As the employees tried to explain, phones lit up around the room with a single jarring headline. A startling news alert flashed across Jonathan's phone. Anonymous tip claims Jonathan Blake's paternity test is fake. The headline blazed across every phone screen in the boardroom. Anonymous tip claims Jonathan Blake's paternity test is fake. A knot tightened in Jonathan's stomach. Whispers erupted around the table, and board members exchanged wary glances. Richard, seated off to the side, tilted his head with a satisfied little smirk. Jonathan glanced at Marcus, who wore an expression of quiet alarm. Ms. Yang set down her phone and looked at Jonathan with urgent concern. Outside, employees huddled in small groups, the news fueling their hushed discussions. Jonathan could practically feel the weight of every eye in the building. He steadied himself, refusing to let fear show. "This so-called tip is just another desperate tactic," he said, raising his voice so that everyone in the room could hear. "I never even took a paternity test. There's nothing to fake. This entire claim is a fabrication." An uneasy murmur drifted around the long table. Some board members appeared skeptical. After all, rumors had plagued Jonathan for weeks. Others seemed open to hearing him out. Richard feigned a pitying sigh, neatly folding his hands. "You've been under a lot of stress," he said. "Rumors fly more easily when there's confusion at the top." Jonathan pressed his palms on the polished wood of the board table. "The only confusion comes from sabotage," he replied calmly. "I have evidence that one of our major shareholders, Richard Myers, has systematically destabilized our company for personal gain." All eyes snapped to Richard, who managed to keep his mouth curved in a thin smile. Are you insinuating I leaked internal information and orchestrated a scandal around your secret family? He asked, voice dripping with feigned offense. That's exactly what I'm saying, Jonathan stated, and he reached into a leather portfolio. Ms. Yang's expression hardened with determination, while a few other board members leaned in, curiosity lighting their faces. Jonathan lifted the documents for everyone to see. These are authenticated files showing shell companies tied to Richard's personal accounts. Money has been funneled in ways that coincide with our stock dips and the tabloid's timing. Richard's face remained impassive, but Jonathan saw a flicker of tension in the man's jaw. Ridiculous, Richard said. These documents are likely forgeries. Anyone with a grudge could manufacture them. Or perhaps you did, Mr. Blake, in an effort to distract from your personal failures. A few board members shifted uneasily, clearly unsure whom to believe. Jonathan glanced at Ms. Yang, who rose from her seat and pointed to the pages. I had an independent forensic accountant verify these, she said. They show consistent patterns of insider trading, and the IP addresses linked to leaked documents trace back to one of Richard's shell companies. That pronouncement electrified the room. Several board members began talking all at once, their voices a cacophony of anger, confusion, and dismay. The CFO, who had spent the last week struggling to quell the company's upheaval, flipped through the data with growing shock. Richard tried to counter with a flurry of denials, but the tide was turning. "Let's restore order," one of the senior board members finally shouted, banging a gavel on the table's surface. "We'll not solve this in chaos." Gradually, the noise subsided. Jonathan straightened, refusing to let the swirl of tension knock him off balance. For weeks I've been under attack, both professionally and personally. My family has been harassed, my credibility questioned. I'm done playing defense. He paused, glancing at the CFO and the others around the table. I may be a CEO, but first and foremost, I'm a father who can't allow malicious rumors to ruin two innocent girls' lives. A hush fell as he continued. I accept that I haven't always been transparent about my private affairs, but the truth is simple. Imani, my ex-wife, and I share two children, Layla and Leah. They're my daughters. I never took a paternity test because I didn't need one, and if there's confusion, it's because I chose to keep them away from the cruelty of public scrutiny while I sorted out the company's issues. Marcus quietly stepped forward and placed another folder on the table. A carefully compiled set of personal records, photos, and letters that confirmed Jonathan's role as a father, dating back to the earliest glimpses of the girl's existence in Imani's life. He'd gathered them with Imani's permission, hoping to dispel the swirl of lies. Jonathan spread the pages with a steady hand. These confirm my daughter's birth dates and my name on certain official forms, left unpublicized. I wasn't aware of their existence at first, which is on me, but it doesn't make them any less mine. And now, for their sake, I'm laying my private life bare. Richard tried again to object, shifting in his seat. This is all very touching, he said. But we came here to discuss the future of the company, not... The future of this company is entangled with your illegal activities. Jonathan cut him off, voice firm. We can't thrive under a board member who manipulates the market and tries to force out leadership through scandal and intimidation. The CFO spoke up at last, looking directly at Richard. If these documents are legitimate, we can't continue working with you. It would tank investor confidence, and we'd face massive legal repercussions. One by one, heads nodded around the table, acknowledging the gravity of the evidence. Ms. Yang stepped in, highlighting the authenticity checks that had been done, the timeline of suspicious stock movements, and the correlations with Richard's maneuvers. Richard's confident facade cracked. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. "You're making a grave mistake," he spat. "I've contributed significantly to the company's growth." "You nearly destroyed it," Jonathan replied, voice calm despite the adrenaline surging through him. "Your contributions don't excuse corporate espionage." A tidal wave of emotion burst in the room. The board members conferred in hushed tones, the CFO shaking his head in anger and betrayal. At last, one of the senior members made a succinct motion: Richard's immediate removal from the board, pending an internal investigation and possible criminal charges. Richard's mouth twisted in fury. He slammed a fist on the table, glaring at Jonathan. "You'll regret this." Jonathan met his glare head-on. "No, Richard. You will." Security stepped in to ensure Richard left the premises. As he was escorted out, the board members pivoted toward Jonathan, some contrite for doubting him, others still rattled by the scandal. The CFO asked, "Are you willing to remain in your leadership role?" "Yes," Jonathan answered, relief weaving through his tension. "But first, we repair the damage. We make a public statement clarifying the truth, that Richard acted alone, that the company stands united, and I want it known that my family, my daughters, are off limits. We will protect them." The board, seeing the determination in his eyes, gradually agreed. The path ahead wouldn't be easy. They'd have to rebuild trust with investors, handle the legal fallout of Richard's downfall, and navigate the media's unrelenting curiosity. But at least the cancer within the company had been exposed. After the board meeting concluded, Jonathan stepped into the hallway, heart thudding. Marcus followed close behind, a rare grin on his face. "We did it," he murmured, clapping Jonathan on the shoulder. "Finally." Jonathan let out a breath he felt he'd been holding for weeks. "It's not over," he said, "but it's a start." Outside, word had already spread. Reporters crowded the lobby, hungry for a statement. Security guards kept them from surging forward as Jonathan emerged. Cameras flashed, and microphones angled in his direction. He raised a hand, and the commotion quieted just enough for him to speak. "I understand the public has questions," he said, voice carrying through the clang of cameras. "I can confirm I have 2 daughters, Layla and Leah, whom I love deeply. Recent rumors of a fake paternity test are just that, rumors. And as of now, Richard Myers is no longer a part of this company. We've uncovered serious misconduct. The details will emerge in due time." Reporters erupted in shouted queries. Jonathan gave a few measured answers, then excused himself, refusing to feed the frenzy further. Spotting his driver's car waiting curbside, he slipped into the back seat. Marcus got in on the passenger side, phone already buzzing. The first call Jonathan made was to Imani. She answered on the 3rd ring, voice tight with anticipation. "How did it go?" "Richard's out," Jonathan said, letting himself finally smile. "The board believed the evidence. We'll face some fallout, but it's manageable." Imani's sigh was like a release of weeks of tension. "That's good news, really good news. I'll handle the media," Jonathan promised gently, "so the girls can have their normal lives back. If we do this right, the press will lose interest soon enough." There was a pause. Then, softly, "Thank you. I know you did this for more than just the company. You did it for them." Jonathan closed his eyes, relief crashing through him. "I did it for all of us. I meant what I said. I'm here for them, no matter what." Late that afternoon, he visited Imani's house. This time, no paparazzi waited outside. The scandal's tide seemed to have turned. Layla and Leah squealed in delight when they saw Jonathan bounding over to show him their latest drawings. Imani stood by the window, arms folded casually, a tentative smile catching the corners of her mouth. Jonathan felt an ache of gratitude. Everything he valued was in this room. Soon after, they decided to take a short walk around the block, just the 4 of them, to test if the media had truly backed off. The sun cast a warm glow on the sidewalks, and a gentle breeze ruffled the girls' hair. It felt almost ordinary, if not for the quiet security detail maintaining distance behind them. At one point, Leah asked if she could hold Jonathan's hand. A lump formed in his throat as he nodded. Layla grinned and grabbed Imani's. They strolled together, a small unit, overshadowed no longer by fear but by the bright possibility of what might come next. By the time evening descended, Jonathan had to return to the office to finalize statements. Imani sent him off with a grateful look, the twins clinging in a brief hug before letting him go. Once he wrapped up urgent calls and emails, he found himself in front of the building's exit doors, the city lights shining through the glass. Outside, a single reporter recognized him. "What now, Mr. Blake?" the reporter called. Jonathan paused, spotting Layla and Leah waiting for him just beyond the doors, with Imani nearby. He realized he had the answer right there in front of him. He walked over, taking each twin by the hand, and offered the reporter a confident smile. "I have a family to protect," he said simply, "and that's all that matters." If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Just click on the screen.